Welcome to Unlearn, where we talk to industry leaders about unlearning how we go to market.
I'm Kelly Sarabyn, and I run tech partner enablement and advocacy at HubSpot.
And I'm Asher Matthew, co-founder of Partnership Leaders.
The old ways of going to market are getting more expensive and less effective.
To thrive in an era of digital transformation, you have to go to market differently. Let's find out how. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Unlearn podcast. And today we're going to take a detour. Maybe that's the right word. Kelly, correct me if my English is not correct. All right. I'm an ESL. We're not going to cover partnerships as a topic because that's what we do all the time. And we're going to take a little bit of a detour and talk about a super important topic, which at least I feel like it is. Kelly may disagree. But also I met somebody at a conference, which I thought was like absolutely fantastic. So I'm like, and then I became a big fan of his work. And then I'm like, we got to figure out how to get this guy on the podcast. And then I think, Tobias, you ended up having a baby, or your family was having a baby, right?
Yep.
So they're like, oh man, babies spoil every good moment. No, just kidding. Babies are super special. So long story short, like I was at this summit conference, which is fantastic. It was on a cruise ship with founders and CEOs and creators for 2.5 days. And Tobias gave a talk on just the chaos that social media creates in companies and how it creates this like really weird environment inside those companies and the steps we can do to fix it. And then I said, you know what, we're just gonna have Tobias on the podcast and let's have a conversation with him. So Tobias, like I know I've talked a little bit about you, but feel free to like intro yourself a little bit so people actually know all the amazing work that you're doing, and then we can start the convo.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you guys for having me. This is a pleasure being on here. Asher, I really enjoyed our conversation at the conference, and yeah, it was a wild experience. So yeah, my name is Tobias. Tobias Rose-Stockwell. I wrote a book called Outrage Machine, which is about how tech, and specifically certain types of tech, amplify a kind of discontent, both in workplaces and in politics and our interpersonal relationships outside of work as well. And I've been studying this stuff for the last 10 years, roughly. I've been writing this book for the last 6.5, 7 years. So it just came out last year. Paperback comes out a little bit later this year. And yeah, I've been focusing very, very closely on the ways that social media disrupts our capacity for empathy, for understanding, focus, for creativity, all of these different things, and specifically thinking about ways of fixing it. So that's my background.
And maybe we should have Kelly introduce herself to you too, because like normally our guests are in the partnerships world, so they know us, or at least they've seen us on LinkedIn. But given that you're the first non-partnerships guest for us, Kelly, you want to introduce yourself to him too.
Sure. I work in partnerships at HubSpot. So I work on our product partnerships team. And before this, I was actually leading marketing at an early stage startup. So definitely given a lot of thought to social media, both personally and professionally. The real question, though, Asher, is did you read the book after you had the conversation, or did you schedule this podcast to avoid reading the book?
Well, folks who know me, it's like I'm a really bad like reader, but like if I can have an awesome conversation and then I want to continue the conversation, guess what? I just invite people to the podcast.
Totally fair.
But I'm a huge reader, so I will read your book.
Yeah, so basically what happens is like Kelly reads stuff and then I call her up and I'm like, hey, did you see that? And she's like, yeah. I'm like, what happened? And then that's how I get my education these days.
Perfect. Yeah, having a conversation in some ways is just as valuable as reading a tome. But yeah,
So
I'm hoping this will go in an interesting, different direction as well from maybe the core stuff in the book too. So because this is such a unique conversation here. So,
but I would love to kind of hear what you found on the more company side of things, because I think on the personal side of things, right? Like people have been talking for at least a decade on how like the polarization, the bubbles, the anonymous, how that unleashes things. And I think I've less heard people make commentary on more on the company side and how that might have an impact.
Sure. Yeah. So, we think when we think of social media, we tend to think of Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, maybe YouTube, TikTok, these external platforms. And they do definitely influence the ways that companies present themselves. But there's a whole suite of tools that we use inside of companies that have some of the exact same mechanics and features that these external tools have, right? So Slack, for instance, is a type of social media that does fundamentally change how we operate within the workplace. And there's some very interesting studies showing that Slack is actually dramatically impactful in a negative way to our productivity because of the kind of currency of attention and how it extracts it from us on a regular basis. So while it is one of these things that doesn't feel like traditional social media, it absolutely is. And there are a number of these design frameworks that have made their way into internal company systems and tools that actually do have much of the same kind of problematic effects that traditional social media does, but we don't call them social media because they're internal. So we can put those in a couple different categories. We can put them in the productivity category or like lack of productivity category, right? Detrimental to the productivity category.
Oh, I'm going to be on the phone with the Slack team like in an hour. So I'll make sure.
Oh, great. Perfect. bring these complaints.
Exactly.
Right.
Like your design,
yeah, and then there's these kind of downstream effects that come from having so many employees in these environments, which I liken to physical environments because they are much like actual physical spaces that we are inhabiting, right? So I usually start my presentations with this single line, which is, "You are not here. You are in another room now." And because we have on our devices uh, simultaneous conversations that are happening in the background of our head, of our attention all the time, right? And these ambient rooms that we are inside of, these digital spaces, actually do dramatically affect how we operate interpersonally and as social organisms, as business organisms, right? They actually change how we interact. And a lot of that comes in the form of kind of performance and the way that we perform in these spaces, right? When we're in a room on a stage with a large audience, we act differently than we do if we're in a small room with a couple of friends, right? And those mechanics of the design of these tools fundamentally change how we interact, and that's a really important point.
Super interesting. We use Slack at HubSpot, and we have 8,000 employees, right? So similar to a physical space, there's every kind of level of, I guess, crowds, right? You have channels that are company wide, then you have ones that might be team wide, and then sub team wide, and then you have all the DMs happening, right? And we
Right, in the
also
background, yeah.
yeah, so it is interesting. I mean, I think that I'd be curious in terms of, so especially with so many companies remote, right? Like in tech, it's definitely the last couple of years have pushed this even more.
Right.
But what are some of the ways, because work is a little bit different and personal, right? You're less likely to have that anonymous. First of all, in Slack, usually it's not going to be anonymous, right? Like the employees are all identified. So you don't have that where you might have on some personal social networks. But I guess what is the ways that, leaving aside the point about like the distraction of attention, what are the ways that it kind of changes social dynamics within work? So if we're
Sure.
all in a big office, right, we might have, we'll have company-wide meetings, we'll have team meetings, we'll have one-to-one meetings. So you have the similar levels, but like, how does it change the fact that it's now digital interaction and more written than it is the other ways that we more subtly communicate when we're human to human?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest and strangest recognitions in both like researching this book deeply and going through the kind of history of tech and media disruptions is just recognizing how strange and foreign the act of writing is, and what writing something down in a text box, how that actually changes what you are saying and how it is read, how it is heard, right, in the other direction. So we tend to think about it as kind of this neutral thing because we grow up, it's one of the first skills we learn as a kid. But when we actually put something into a text box, it actually changes, it strips out a tremendous amount of information from the way that we are trying to say something, right? And then leaves a bunch of ambiguities present for the interpreter of that information, right? So if you ever,
so misunderstandings can be rife, right? Misinterpretations.
Absolutely, yeah. So and I'm not sure if I really understood this until I was researching this book, just how powerful and transformative it is to just put your ideas into a text box versus saying them out loud. I mean, have you ever gotten that text with a period on it? And you're like, whoa, like this person's being extra serious now, right? You're like, what is this about, right? Like that, like something as simple as that, right? Is power. Like you're like, oh wow, that's extra emphasis there. Are they mad at me, right? And we've ended up with this entire new lexicon of communication through emojis and through through custom gifs and custom reactions and stuff to add more of that humanness back into these interactions. But there is something that is absolutely lost when we put things into text. So that's just in the format itself. That's just in the way that the content comes out of us and how it's potentially misinterpreted or it's contextless when we are consuming it. But when it comes to the broader dynamics of what happens when we're in these spaces, right? So if you're in a physical room and say you're in your company right now with 8,000 people, and there's it's a company all hands, and you're actually in the same physical room, you're basically in an auditorium. It's a lot of people. For someone, the threshold for someone to get up and say something is actually pretty high, and they're putting themselves on display, and there's going to be emotion in their voice. They're presenting themselves. They're presenting an entire kind of persona and attitude and emotion that comes with that. And that's actually a higher threshold than it is to just type something and put it out there into a text box, right? And it's a different thing. I'm not saying it's better or worse necessarily, but it's a fundamentally different thing. And I think that there's a lot of kind of noise that gets potentially unsaid, right? When you don't have to actually put it into a text box in front of other people, right? When you don't have to actually get in front of other people in person and explain it to them. So I think that is a piece of it. And then there's these more subtle things which happen not in the content itself, but in the what's underneath, right? Which are social metrics, which are the likes, the comments, the ways that people can chime in to appreciate something, which is like objectively helpful information much of the time, right? Objectively helpful information is helpful to know how many people like something, how many people don't like something, but it also allows for a sort of subtle competition to happen that does make us change the type of content that we express in these spaces, right? So there's this very strange phenomenon that happens in these text-based social networks in which moral emotion, in which text content that has moral emotion in it, like I am disgusted by this, I am angry about this person, I am outraged by X, that actually tends to be tremendously engaging for people, and it will get large quantities of attention, like just in views, and also responses in terms of likes, in terms of comments, in terms of shares, that kind of thing. So it tends to be kind of a sieve that is pulling out moral information from us, and then if you have any kind of engagement algorithm ranking that content, it tends to put it at the top of our feeds. So all this taken together, these digital spaces do fundamentally have a kind of different valence to them in how we share information, consume information, than traditional physical spaces, even though we are inhabiting them kind of constantly in this more ambient way.
Tell us a little bit about the research for the book, right? Because Obviously, you were saying you've been in the space for let's say 10 years, and I feel like that's research in itself, but then the formal research process for a book like this, like I'm super curious about it.
Yeah. So, wow. Yeah. The formal research process looks like a lot of conversations with academics and designers and product people. And so I lived and worked in Silicon Valley for better part of 7 years. And during that time, I was a designer, had a lot of friends that were very early at Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And in those days, of course, there was this like very kind of euphoric optimism about what tech could do to change the world. And we've
Yeah.
since, I think that shine has come off a little bit since then.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got really fascinated by what it took to build these companies, to scale these companies, and what the impacts were on the other end of it. Over the course of the last 5 years, I've been working closely with Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at NYU, who studies. He's a social psychologist and he studies the foundations of moral emotions. He also just came out with a book called The Anxious Generation, which is a pretty big book about how social media affects kids' mental health, and how specifically a subset of teens are really, really, really deeply impacted negatively by social media, and the phone-based childhood in general. So I've worked very closely with him, both in the development of this book as well as collaborators at Yale and at Columbia, developing, just trying to categorize all the research possible that we could find. So
Yeah.
basically, the research process involves reading a lot of papers and talking to a lot of academics and a lot of designers and a lot of people, and trying to put that into digestible, understandable, nuanced, both kind of text as well as like finding good metaphors and analogies to help people understand this stuff. So the book is pretty like analogy heavy, which I think is a good vehicle for explaining this stuff. But
Don't worry, Kelly. I'm not going to write a book.
Well, I know that you'd have to have a ghostwriter. You'd pay Tobias a large amount of money. To what degree do you feel like you or Jonathan were able to get the information from the tech companies as to how things go behind the scenes? Because we all remember a couple of years ago when there was like a Facebook whistleblower about something that, one wouldn't think that there would need to be. But obviously, they're businesses, they want to make money, right? So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest. Their top priority is not the moral growth of the next generation or their happiness, right? And so they may factor those things in, but I do think as researchers and writers, right, there's a little bit of a push and pull. Do you feel like through conversations with people who worked there, you were able to access enough information to have a solid sense of how things are operating behind the scenes?
Yeah. And that was both, enlightening and worrying. The enlightening part is that there are a lot of really good people working at these companies, and the kind of I think tired polemic about these companies being evil and it's all Mark Zuckerberg's fault is just very incorrect, and not based in reality. I think that if you look at the history and trajectory of any one of these social media companies, they all fall into this kind of dark valley as they hit scale, which is that they all hit these kind of weird edge case scenarios in which bad actors exploit a vulnerability, or there's a certain kind of engagement optimization that actually attenuates to outrage and not something else, and they've turned it up because their metrics are wrong or their metrics are bad in the first place, right? Which is like, just engagement is the number one metric. So if engagement is the number one metric, then we're winning, right? Because time on site is number one. And that's just like a bad metric for kind of a holistic, good company over the long term, right? It's not actually a good way to run a news business, a media company, really. And these companies are media companies now, right? They are basically kind of news companies, media companies in a lot of ways. They do a lot of the things that newspapers used to do. They've taken up a lot of that whole kind of mind share and attention share that we used to spend our time reading the news through and stuff. Now we go to social media for that much of the time. Um, and yeah, they all fell into these similar traps, right? Like it's not like they all schemed to do this, but there's a bunch of things that you can do that will make money and get engagement in the short term that will actually cause a lot of problems down the road, like a lot of problems for your audience down the road. And they all independently have fallen into those traps. And it's strange, one of the strange exceptions kind of being, and I say this with like a big asterisk, but one of the strange exceptions being TikTok, which has tried aggressively to curate its content and its feed to avoid much of the kind of, outrage and polarizing content, just because they are under such intense scrutiny. So I don't give them like moral props. I think it's more of a kind of a strategic play on their front to try to avoid scrutiny, and delving too deeply into some of that stuff. But they still fall into it at times too. So yeah, I don't think it's any one of these companies. Like I don't think it was any kind of innate evil that was driving these issues that have come up, but they are outcomes that have happened. One of the weird things that's happened in the last couple of years, and I will say this is like an unfortunate side effect. I've been talking to a lot of whistleblowers. One of my good friends was one of the first engineers of Twitter, and they're very aware of what a lot of these problems are. Like they're aware before a lot of the public is. Like not all the public, but like they're aware before most of the people in public are actually aware of many of these issues, and they do some research on it internally, or at least they used to, until there was a few of these whistleblower reports, and then they actually started shutting down internal research because they didn't want the liability associated with it. Because whistleblower reports make them look really bad when they have the research showing something bad happened, and they didn't do something about it. So that's the kind of unfortunate thing, is that in recent years, I think the trust and safety teams have really taken a big hit, and partially due to Elon's example and gutting Twitter and turning to X. But yeah, I'm hopeful that we'll work it out. I am, even after writing a book about all the problems associated with this stuff. I am actually really hopeful we'll work it out.
And I feel like LinkedIn is like completely falling. I mean, when I started using LinkedIn, it was a network, and people had these small circles, and now I feel like there are circles within circles within circles, and then some content is shown to some people, some content isn't shown to some people, and then there's this creator explosion. And now every week I hear people are like upset because their reach is down because they don't get the same impressions, and so I feel like we've kind of fallen into this thing that you're talking about. And now I can feel it, because like I have friends who are creators, and all they complain, all they talk about when I try to talk to them about LinkedIn is how much their reach is down.
Yeah,
It's
that's a tough
interesting
one
too, because I would say, and I think this is true of Slack as a workplace forum, but LinkedIn as well. The content that tends to do well on LinkedIn often will have an emotional arc and a personal story, but I wouldn't really describe outrage as playing well either in your work Slack or on LinkedIn. I've rarely seen it, and people are interested, but it's just not. There's huge social professional costs to being outraged on LinkedIn or on your internal Slack,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
People,
yeah, it's true.
So it really doesn't. So I'd be curious if you kind of saw there that it's different emotions or different arcs that are most prominent.
Yeah, there's some really interesting research and like a history there of LinkedIn about what LinkedIn did to try to make its feed less toxic. So if you remember back in the day, I mean, most social media back in the day didn't have a feed, right? Didn't actually have a news feed at all. When you were LinkedIn, you got LinkedIn with, you're LinkedIn with someone, you're like, LinkedIn, like, what does that mean? I don't know. We're connected, but we can't, like, there's not like a feed or anything. We can't do anything here. So they implemented a feed pretty early on, and then they actually stopped. They like turned it off. They turned it off because I think they were seeing some of these spikes in kind of garbage content and spam and all these other issues that come in with networks like this, with user generated content networks like this. And they turned it off. And then I believe it was I'm gonna get this date wrong. Whenever they restarted the feed, I want to say it was like 2017 or something like that. Whenever they restarted the feed, and they made it they made a version of it that was read only. And they went out and made a selection of specific influencers that could post to the feed. So it was basically like available to everyone. You're going to get global reach with this if you're an influencer, but it's a very small number of influencers that actually get that reach in the earliest days. And the reason they did that was because they were trying to do something which I think is very important, not talked about very much, is they were trying to establish norms for what kind of content should be allowed on the platform, right? So, if we go to this analogy of the room, of the physical room, when we walk into any room, we're trying to figure out what that room is about, right? We're trying to figure out what it is we are supposed to do in this space. And to do that, we look to the other people in the room to what they're doing, right? So we look, if it's the reason why professional, like Slack, it tends to be professional. A WhatsApp group tends to be like just crazy, right? And if it's a public WhatsApp group or is a public Slack group, it's like just stuff is totally different in those rooms, largely because there's established norms in those spaces, right? And the same way we look around the room and be like, okay, cool, these people are being quiet, like the room is quiet, so I'm going to be quiet, right? This room is rowdy, so I'm going to be rowdy, right? We deduce the norms of a room based on the other actors in the room, and that's a hidden piece of the puzzle when it comes to social media, like X, right? You log onto X these days, it's like, it's a fire hose of, I mean, mostly AI stuff these days, and then like some porn, like light porn and AI stuff. I feel like that's
I was going to say, I'm not actually logging into X these days, so I wouldn't know, but it sounds like
it's
might
different.
be
It's
where
a
you would
weird
imagine.
place. Yeah. But like those first like 5 posts that you see are going to give you a reference point for the norms of that room, the culture of that room, of that space that you are in right away. And so LinkedIn tried to basically engineer this culture. And then before they opened it up to the feed back up to the wider audience, they just made sure that culture was kind of entrenched more or less. And like, I think that in general, LinkedIn is a much, much less toxic place than other social media platforms, partially because of the inherent fact that it is professional, but also partially because of these deduced norms that people get when they are observing others in this space, right? It's like plucky self-promotion and, success and stuff like that. And that generally feels good to be around versus people, morally grandstanding or speaking about specific polemics and stuff. And so those norms are both emergent on their own, and then they're reinforced by the algorithms, right? By the type of algorithm that you have in the space as well, right? So I think that's a really important thing to think about, because we basically have robots in these rooms with us that are choosing what people are allowed to say things, or what people's mics are on the loudest at different times. They're picking that as they go along. And if you have an algorithm that is just a natural straight engagement algorithm, is going to reward outrage, versus if you have an algorithm that is chronological, it's going to just reward the person that's going to give people the voice that's spoken most recently. But yeah, so it's really important to think about that stuff, because it's very subtle, but it dramatically affects how we operate in these spaces.
And were you able to get information, right? Like, everyone on LinkedIn is always trying to figure out how they are serving content, right? Because people who are trying to use it to increase their professional reach are trying to game it. I personally, like, for a long time, people were like, oh, you got to put the links in. I think they still say this, put the links in your comment, not in your post. And I'm like, I'm not doing that, because that's inconvenient as I'm reading someone's post and then you have to dig through 40 comments to find the article. So I'm like, but I'm also not like obsessed with optimizing my reach. So were you able through your research to kind of because I feel like in the earlier days of social media, it might have been much more simple, but I would assume now they're looking to have multiple factors go into the play, right? Like, it's who you're connected to, first, second, third, perhaps. Like, is there ways that they're innovating to like kind of almost editorialize, not on the like level of reading the post, but rather finding out whose engagement might be higher value and then surfacing when that person likes or comments versus just an average person likes or comments on everything? That person's opinion might be, and depending who you're connected to, your view might be more substantive, right? Like, because LinkedIn knows your job title, they know your experience.
Right.
Are they looking to refine it in that way?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think this is like the constant cat and mouse, which is trying to find the, like there's this interesting balance between transparency. Like you want a transparent algorithm, right? Like we want transparency algorithms so that like we know what people are saying and how we want to feel like we have agency in the the decision of like what our feeds are doing and like what our reach is, for instance, like you said, right? But if that's too transparent, then yeah, people just game it to spam, right? They want to get in there so they can get into people's brains as quickly as possible. That's like kind of the fun. I don't have any recent specific data on what is most effective on LinkedIn, but that fundamental kind of tension is going to constantly be there, which is they have an idea of what quality content is, and who you are and how to get that quality content to you. And who your content should go to, and that's constantly changing, and that's a very sophisticated algorithm that they're trying to build all the time. And yeah, I think that's unfortunately very much part of the game of reach these days, is everyone's trying to hack the algorithm. Whether or not it's working or not, it's and I think it's really funny because you end up seeing these weird kind of cargo cult like behaviors
Yep.
around people trying to kind of hack the algorithm. It's like, oh, if you put a photo in, but your photo has to be looking forward, and you have to have a smile on your face, and like all these things that people say that they need to do in order to get the reach that they want, and it like it maybe worked once, and then they maybe change the algorithm again, but people keep doing it for a long time. It's very strange. Yeah.
It is funny. Or even the content's like templated. It's like on LinkedIn, it's like, oh, I was fired post like goes really strong. And then so everyone, to your point, starts copying it. And then it is interesting, right? And we don't really know behind the scenes how it's amplifying it. But
Right.
But I feel like you said, A, you're hopeful about the future of social media, and B, that your book is kind of solution oriented. So I'd assume that like how content is served, and to others is something that you've given a ton of thought to. And is that something you have recommendations for in your like ideal social media platform, whether it's just a personal for social reasons or professional or both, as to what metrics they should be looking at, and what ways are going to kind of optimize the long-term experience and success of the platform?
So right before we go to solutions, because that's where I was going to think we would go next, anyways. But so if you just summarize like the first, let's say 30 minutes for our listeners, right? So the designers and the engineers of these tools, let's call them all, bucket them into the productivity bucket, right? um, they were asked to go point to a certain metric called engagement, right? Because engagement then induces virality, and then virality gets more people signed up, which then makes a product, gives us that explosive thing like we are seeing with ChatGPT right now, right? Uh, and then you kind of end up with unintended consequences, which is some of this outrage that you see, right? That's kind of where we are in this convo, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good cherry picking of where we
Okay.
are. Yeah, like
Is
every
it-
company has found themselves in
Totally.
these positions of kind of propagating outrage in unexpected ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we like partnership leaders is primarily running on Slack, and as you were kind of saying all the things that you're saying, and I'm like, when we started, all we did was cared about engagement, and till this day, we also care about engagement. And it wasn't until our dinner when then I was thinking, oh, this metric is actually not the right metric. There's other spaces in the let's call it like proverbial community that we've created, or digital community that we've created, that maybe will have different rules that they interact for interaction. And we ended up creating peer groups. And the minute we created peer groups, people stopped interacting in the public channels, and now we have 300 peer groups. And all it is people self-select on a topic, and then they join a peer group, and the peer groups are like 9 to 11 people, and they run for 6 weeks or so, or some of them can run longer. But I remember there's one peer group that has been meeting for the last, I want to say 4 years, like ever since we started, and nobody in that peer group actually goes and interacts with anything in the larger community, because we have 17 channels, we have 1,800 people. So as you can imagine, like there's like conversations happening, right? But that group has been meeting for 4 years, and I think there's 16 people in it now. And they go on vacations. Some of those people go on vacations together. Some of those people have changed jobs. They trade north. So there's like this like little community within that big community, and it completely defies all the other metrics that we have. And those people have renewed technically their subscription with us for the last 4 years. I mean, it's pretty incredible to kind of see this, like find this space. And it wasn't until your conversation with me that we were having on the boat. So then I said, oh, you know what? We got to figure something out. So we haven't solved this problem yet. This is why I was excited to have you on the podcast. So we can talk a little bit about the solutions of this thing. But fascinating, just super fascinating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Let's move to the solution side. Like, what are some of the things people can do to solve this thing inside their companies? Because I think
there's what individuals can do, but there's also what can the companies do.
Totally. Because like you're saying, Kelly, like in some cases you have this like disruptive behavior, but in a lot of cases there isn't. So people are just holding it inside themselves, even though they may be feeling something. So how do we solve for that?
Or I'd like to go to for the company layer first, right? Like if you were designing or ran the social media company, what would be the core metrics that employees were going after, and how would content be surfaced to people within the network?
So, sorry, the question is, if I was running a social media company, if I was like one of the big boys or an internal company, like if I was running a company and I wanted to run the right kind of social media, social media.
No, if you were running X or Facebook or LinkedIn, any one of your choosing.
Yeah, okay. That'd be different.
Immediately was scratching his head thinking, I'm like, maybe not that company.
Yeah, no. I mean, look, I have a lot of kind of design solutions that I think are potentially really valuable for these companies. Okay. For X specifically, which is one of the few truly massive public spaces, still like for text-based communication. Facebook has become a little bit of walled off since then, right? There's less kind of public posting on Facebook now. It's like a little bit more like people in their individual communities, and then YouTube and Twitter are kind of just public video channel, or sorry, YouTube and TikTok are public video channels right now. I think that there's really some very, very deep need for basically some kind of egalitarian reflection in the way that these algorithms operate for people, right? So we're talking about the kind of tension between the gamers, the people that, not the gamers, but like the people that want to game the algorithm. Yeah. We call them the spammers, maybe. That's like maybe a mean way of saying it, but like the people that want to game the algorithm and transparency is kind of these ideas of transparency that are present. But one of the kind of primary issues is that the way that the information transits in these platforms is that there's an inverse relationship between truth and virality online, unfortunately, right? That actually like if you say something online that is true, and you say the false version of that statement, right, that is salacious and emotional, it's going to get 6x the viral traction, the diffusion in the network than the true statement is, right? And those are natural network effects there's the natural effects of the network on X these days, right? So 6x diffusion for a lie versus a falsehood. And that's really not good, right? If you're thinking about how we figure out what is real in the world, what kind of politicians we platform versus don't platform, right? What kind of people we want to have this megaphone, right? So if you get 6x the diffusion for a lie versus a falsehood, then you need to counterweight that in a way that is not outraging to the people that actually post that, right? So one of the biggest problems we've seen in these big public forums is that content moderation has become like the most difficult flashpoint, right? It hits all our politics. It's like, allegedly the U.S. government was working with Twitter to censor certain types of information. And as soon as you have any kind of hint of censorship there, then people freak out and it goes into kind of free speech debate on the side. That doesn't need to happen. And there are ways of building these tools so that fact checking and demotion and promotion can happen in a transparent way, so that if you do see something, right? So if you do see something that's false, that's transiting widely, and X has a feature called community notes these days that is like sort of a version of this, where you basically the community can add context and try to fact check a tweet as it's going viral, as a post as it's going viral. We need to scale those kind of mechanisms up dramatically on these platforms. See, I got a little thumbs up for that. We need to dramatically scale those platforms up.
Checking
I
your
know. Talk about design structures. These reactions. Oh my gosh, I'm so frustrated by that. I just turned them off. So we need to dramatically scale that up, because the fact checking apparatus of these systems, if you think about this inherent bias we have towards falsehoods now going viral, then we need to fix that in a way that is transparent to people, so there's a level, so people can see what it is. Like, okay, cool. This has been flagged false, but why has it been flagged false? Is it just some liberal fact checker going out there and shutting down this important voice and trying to censor, or is there actually some baseline evidence beneath it, right? What are the citations behind this statement, right? Citations are one of the easiest things we could do to validate the information that transits on these platforms, right? So just make sure that if something is going to reach the largest audience possible, that it has a minimum number of citations embedded in it. And that simple process, like a minute, like say it's two citations from relatively reputable sources, that would mitigate, I would say, 80% of the viral misinformation problems that we're facing right now. It's just a simple act of citing from reputable sources. And this is all like an algorithm that can be built, right? It's not that hard to do. I think scaling it is going to be something, and encouraging the public to engage with it in a trustworthy way, that's something as well. But I think the issue right now with content moderation is it feels very heavy-handed, and it feels very opaque, and it feels very opaque. and when it goes in a direction that feels against our political views, then we feel incensed by that, right? We feel like we're being silenced, and we feel like there's this we go into conspiracy land. And these systems need to be much more transparent and much more oriented towards validation and verification of information than they are right now.
So are you recommending a kind of Wikipedia style crowdsourced fact checking? Is that what you're saying?
It's like Wikipedia augmented by a very effective user interface that allows for a lot of people to plug in, and allows for also augmented by AI. I think the AI is probably
I was going
a
to
piece of
say.
it. Yeah, like just for, I have a couple, I've been working with a team of engineers and designers on some prototypes of this, of like how this might work, just to get people's ideas moving in the space. In the past, I've done basically design mock-ups for different features that have been adopted by these major platforms. I'm working on kind of a set in this space right now, but it's pretty simple, which is basically like give people a way to check the claims and weigh in on the claims of things as they are transiting the network, as they are going viral. And exactly. Wikipedia is the best example we have of that, which is the number one resource for knowledge in the world, right? It is free. It is open to anyone to comment on, to post, and somehow it is more accurate than traditional encyclopedias. Study shows actually more accurate than traditional encyclopedias, even though it's available to anyone to post on. That is an incredible resource to humanity, and that is all because of the way it's designed. We could have a similar design structure embedded in social media platforms without too much difficulty.
And I think that's why people trust it, right? Because nobody's going to trust when X or Facebook or anyone says, oh, we've hired these content moderators. They
Totally.
are objective and neutral. They, right. People are going to your point, when it doesn't align, they're going to be like, no, that's biased. We're fact checking the fact checkers. But I do think Wikipedia is a great example, and people think of it as very neutral, right? Like, people don't say, I've never heard people say, oh, Wikipedia is liberal bias, or it's like right crazy. It's comes across as neutral, and I think it is hopeful if it can work in that forum that it could be embedded into social networks.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's not. I don't think this is the like we've done many more complex things than build verification engines, right? Like we can do this. Like this is not the worst thing in the world. The problem is there are some like disincentives from a financial perspective to do this, right? And I think that is an important piece of it, which is that there's short term financial incentives to getting people outraged about lies, and my argument that I make in all of my talks and all of my conversations with different engineers and developers, designers, and everyone, politicians, everyone that I speak to about this stuff is that there's actually a larger market for trust. There's more value in building a system that has reputable, verified, valid information over the long term than the viral hit in the short term, right? And if you have a market for trust, you can build all sorts of really valuable things on top of that. And we need to build that value, that market for trust into these platforms. And I think we can get there. I really do think we can get there, but it needs to happen faster than it is.
And
I mean, that was just fantastic. I mean, I didn't think of it as the market for trust. But who are the players? Like, this is super interesting. We're gonna have to bring you back on for another podcast just to like talk about the economics of trust. Because I think that's
Sure.
that would be super interesting. Because I mean, again, we work in the partnership space, so two companies have to work together, and their operating environments and like all these things. There's a lot to unpack there. So tell me a little bit about these trust and research teams, because you're the first person I'm hearing about that these teams exist. And are these teams existing in product organizations? They sit in engineering teams. Super interesting.
You mean trust and safety teams?
Yeah.
Yeah, these are teams that are inside. These are basically researchers that are academics, designers, developers, people that are kind of tend to be safety oriented people that are employed by these companies. By these social media companies to basically make sure the system doesn't go off the rails. They usually deal with a lot of like really dark stuff. Unfortunately, like CSAM, like child abuse,
things,
all this like really dark stuff that ends up on these platforms. You have violence, all these really dark things, and it's their job to basically try to mitigate the spread of that stuff. And these have been problems with online forums since the earliest days of the internet, right? You get a couple of trolls or bad actors into a system, and they start kind of polluting the system with bad stuff, right? And so you do need to have these teams involved in the the cleaning up of the commons, essentially, right? Because it's like what it is. It's a tragedy of the commons. Essentially, you get these large, these large areas in which people don't have an incentive to act well, and so they do bad things, and that bad stuff ends up propagating through the system and staying there and turning other people off and making it toxic. So so trust and safety teams, I think, are doing some of the most important work in the world right now, and they're hidden from view much of the time. They are highly politicized, unfortunately, because again of the censorship issues we talked about just a little while ago. But they are unearthing and fixing some of the worst problems in our modern discourse right there. And I mean by fixing, I mean like actually, like no one wants to see child abuse. No one wants to see violence. No one wants to see car crashes in their feeds, and you need to really be able to build systems. They have whole teams dedicated to kind of turning this stuff down in our feeds, right? And trying to figure out how to train these models to deprioritize that stuff, trying to find bad actors, trying to find Sybil attacks of people that are essentially pretending to be a large number of other people. Like when you have one person that's pretending to be 1,000 other people so that they can, juice the system and juice their likes and stuff, and like all the bot networks, all that stuff. And they are unfortunately hidden from view. It is a thankless job, and it is also what make the internet usable to us.
And safety, yeah, interesting, very interesting. I know we're going to run out of time, and as always, these podcasts, I say this every 4 or 5 podcasts, that we should have a 4-hour long podcast, and maybe we should all meet up and do this. Which, by the way, we should have done this on the boat, or maybe whenever we meet at another summit event, we can do this. But Tobias, what's next for you? Like, how can we help you? Because like you have this book, it's fantastic. At least I think it's fantastic, and the work that you've done is amazing. But but do you offer consulting services then to companies? Because like my call out to people listening to this podcast would be that they should invite you as a featured speaker to their like sales kickoffs or like company kickoffs and things like that. But I'm thinking that you will probably offer consulting services for people to just help them think about design better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I was a designer for a while. I try to help out companies that are working on these thorny issues, for sure. I was management consultant for a while as well, so I very much understand the stuff. And yeah, and I've been on speaking tour since my book came out. So happy to speak to anyone that is struggling with these issues, that's interested in these issues, that wants to understand these issues and how to potentially fix them. This is really my jam right now. And yeah, I'm working on a handful of different design projects. If your audience has interesting designers and developers that want to maybe plug into working on some of the on prototyping some of these solutions, that's also a whole world that I'm working with the team on right now. So very, very happy to help however I can solve some of these problems.
And what would be the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, my website is tobias.cc, and you can reach out to me there. It's pretty easy.
Super. Kelly, any parting thoughts?
I'm surprised you didn't say reach out to me on X.
Right.
With an angry, outrageous falsehood.
That's right.
No, thank you for joining us. This is great.
Yeah, Tobias. Thanks so much for taking some time out here. I mean, this was fantastic, and we're happening to record this podcast at a pretty interesting time, just in the world too, right? Well, the elections and stuff. So hopefully, folks enjoy this content, and then to our listeners, if you enjoy this, drop Kelly and I a note, and then we'll do more of these type of podcasts, or we can go back to our regular programming, which is featuring partnership leaders and what they're doing in the market. Either it's fine. But Tobias, once again, thanks so much for spending time with me. Had a blast with you at the conference, and this was an amazing convo.
Thanks for having me, guys. This is awesome.
Thank you for listening to Unlearn. Subscribe wherever you listen and visit unlearnpodcast.com for the transcripts.